Developmental psychology is kind of special in a way when it comes to research methodology. So I want to take you through some steps in this mini lecture. First, I'm going to review a few things that you should already know from your introduction class, and then I'm going to take you through some designs that are unique to developmental psychology. So the first thing is I just want to review the three main ways that research is typically done. So the first one is descriptive methods, and this is the least powerful method because it basically just allows researchers to describe what is going on. In this case, we can observe something, we can talk about how people react in a certain situation, but we can't really predict, we can't talk about what is causing something, we can only talk about what we see. The next thing would be correlational studies, and as you should know based on your previous classes, is that correlational studies allows us to look at the associations between different variables. So in the future, we'll be able to hopefully predict what is going to go on because of that correlation or that association between different variables. And the last one is experimental research. And this is the most powerful. This is something that we really aim to use if possible. This allows us to really explain what is going on. It allows us to look at cause and effect. And it allows us to also say that, this cause and effect relationship has nothing to do with X, Y, or Z. So if we can use this most powerful technique, why would psychologists ever be interested in using less powerful research methods? Well, let's look at an example. Okay, so an example here is, let's say that you are a researcher and you want to determine whether air pollution impacts child health. Okay, impacts the child health. So you recruit 42-year-olds and obviously their parents and their families, and you randomly allocate 20 of them to be raised in a polluted town, and you randomly allocate the other 20 and their families to live in a town with clean air and water. Now you wait 10 years because you want to see what the effects are, and then you give all of the children a physical, and you want to know, which group is healthier. Now, is this okay? Well, in your mind, you might think, well, no, because, you are now exposing 20 children and their parents to pollution, and you don't know what could happen. I mean, some of you might think, well, we live in LA and, we're doing okay. But what about those polluted towns that have mercury in the water, or that they live in a highly radiated, under their radiation under their soil, which we know can increase the chance of pediatric cancer? Okay, so really, is it fair and is this okay? No, it's not. And so this would be considered highly unethical, because we know the potential for harm that could be done to those 20 who are being raised in a polluted town. But with that being said, sometimes we have to use less powerful research methods when experimental research just is unethical or it's too difficult to conduct. So the first one, the least powerful, is descriptive methods. Now, what is descriptive methods? Okay, well, there's different kinds, and the three that I'm going to talk about. One is observational techniques. This can be either naturalistic observation or structured observation. So for naturalistic observation, let's just say maybe you're interested in seeing how preschoolers deal with a bully in their class. Okay, so maybe there's just, unfortunately, a natural bully in their class, and you want to know, do preschoolers tolerate this? Do they ignore it? Do they completely ostracize them? Do they exclude them? And so you go in a most unobtrusive way, and you try and, maybe you can view them in a one-way mirror, depending on the preschool that they're in, and you just observe. Maybe you video them without them knowing so that you can code it later on. So this is basically you as a researcher looking at something that's going on, something that's truly unfolding in a natural environment. You're not controlling any variables, you're not manipulating any variables, you're just looking at how things naturally unfold. Another one would be a structured observation. And structured observation is where you're kind of setting it up a little bit, but it's not an experiment. So one that I like to think of in this way is the strange situation paradigm, which is Ainsworth's study, and maybe you remember this from attachment in Intro to Psychology class, where basically they want to know, what do children do when they are left in a room with a stranger? and then what happens when their caregiver returns. So in this case, they structured in a way that they're in a laboratory. They bring the mom and the child into the same room for every single dyad, and then a stranger appears, and then the caregiver leaves. And they're recording all of this. And then, of course, the caregiver returns again. And they want to know, they're just simply observing what the child is doing, but it's structured in a way that they have the same setting going on for every single child. Other things that you can do is a clinical or case study, and this is a very in-depth view of one case. So Noam Chomsky, he was interested in language development, and he wanted to know whether chimpanzees can develop language. And so he studied in-depth Nim for many years. This might also be a case when you unfortunately hear cases of children, maybe a child who has been raised in a closet or a locked cage for the last 7 years of their life. And we want to know, we don't, thank goodness, have 50 children who have been locked in a room for the first 7 years of their life. So you want to know first, what is the impact of social isolation? What is the impact of malnutrition? What is the impact of neglect on this one child? So you would study this individual in depth. And the last one would be self-report. And self-reports can be anything from interviews, clinical interviews, structured interviews, or just, and those ones have specific questions that you want to ask, or they might be more of very casual interviews where the conversation just flows, and the next question is based on what the individual or the interviewee said in the previous question. It can be surveys, questionnaires, things like that. Next one is correlational studies. Correlational studies, as you probably remember, is basically when we are looking to see if two variables correlate or are related to each other. So if you remember from this one, you receive a correlation coefficient, which is the statistical measure of the relationship between the two variables. So as you can see right here, the correlation coefficient is R, and you will get an output of a sign plus a number. The number will be anywhere between 0 and 1. Okay, and this indicates the strength of the relationship. So if that number is closer to 0, that means that there's either no relationship or very minimal relationship. If it's closer to 1, that means that there's a pretty strong relationship. If it's somewhere in the middle, it's, a moderate, mild relationship. Now the sign, okay, can either be positive or negative, and that indicates the direction of the relationship. So a positive sign means that as one variable goes up, so does the other variable. So for instance, the more time you spend studying, the greater your grades. Or the more time you spend exercising, the greater your health index. Okay, now there's also could be a negative relationship, and this means that as one variable goes up, the other variable goes down. Okay, so this might be, for instance, the more you shop, which that variable goes up, the less money you have in your bank. So you can see that variable is going down. Or maybe the more time you spend on social media or watching Netflix, the lower your grades. So you can see, again, one variable goes up, that is the more time you spend on social media or Netflix. The other variable goes down, which are your grades. Okay, so the sign indicates the direction of the relationship. Now, just because two factors are correlated does not mean that one factor has caused the other factor, okay? So it doesn't mean that A causes B. We're just talking about the relationship between the two. And that's because a third variable that maybe we didn't study or we're not accounting for in this relationship or this correlation could be accounting for both factors. So for instance, there are some real-world correlations out there, like ice cream consumption positively correlates with drowning. So does that mean that, the more we eat ice cream, the more likely we are to see drowning? No, it just means that the third variable would be hot weather. The hotter the weather, the more likely people are to consume ice cream. The hotter the weather, the more people are to be swimming, and therefore the more people are likely to drown. The last one is experimental research. Okay, and this is where the researcher is controlling the situation. They are trying to manipulate a variable and holding the other ones constant so that we can look at whether A causes B, or looking at this cause and effect relationship. Now, some special designs that are used for studying development, because development is looking at what changes or what remains the same across time, we need to be able to study people at different ages. So there's longitudinal, which means that we're studying the same participants repeatedly at different ages across time. There's cross-sectional, where we're studying different participants at different ages at the same point in time, which I'll go over this in a little bit. And then there's sequential, and this is kind of a combination of both cross-sectional and longitudinal. So let me grab my other slide here. So for longitudinal, what would happen is, remember, we're grabbing the same participants and studying them across time. Okay, so basically, if let's just say we're interested in studying attention span. Okay, and we want to know, does attention span improve across from 2-year-olds to 6-year-olds? And we would expect it would, right? So we want to say, let's study 2-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and 6-year-olds. Well, for longitudinal, remember, we're grabbing the same participants and we're looking at them across time. So in this case, in 2020, we would grab 100 2-year-olds, okay? And we would test them on some type of attention span test, okay? Now, again, we're also interested in 4-year-olds. So in 2022, when they turn 4, now we have 4-year-olds, okay? So the same 2-year-olds are now tested 2 years later. Okay, so hopefully we retain all 100 of them. And now in 2022, we're testing them as 4-year-olds. Now, 2 years later, 2 years pass, and now they are 6-year-olds, okay? So now we still hope that we're having still 100 participants, which is unlikely. But anyway, I'll go over that in a little bit. So as you can see, we are studying the same participants across time. As 2-year-olds, we wait 2 years. We study them again at 4-year-olds. We study them again as 6-year-olds, okay? Now, this is very time-consuming, as you can tell, okay, because we have to wait 4 years to get our results. Another way is cross-sectional. Cross-sectional is when you grab, in 2020, we would grab 2-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and 6-year-olds, okay? And let's just say that we want to study hopefully 30 to 40 in each group. So 30 to 40 2-year-olds, 30 to 40 4-year-olds, 30 to 40 6-year-olds. And this would allow us then to get done with our study in maybe 1 week, okay? And we still can compare how 2-year-olds do compared to 4-year-olds compared to 6-year-olds. Now, sequential is a little bit more tricky. Okay, let's say in 2020, we grab a group of 2-year-olds, okay? And we also grab a group of 4-year-olds. Okay, now 2 years pass. Well, in 2020, we can compare 2-year-olds versus 4-year-olds. Now, we want to look at 4-year-olds and 6-year-olds. Okay, so in 2022 now, these 2-year-olds become 4-year-olds, and the 4-year-olds now become 6-year-olds. So we can still compare 2-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and 6-year-olds, and we can also look at this longitudinal difference. Okay, so you can see that longitudinal is taking the same group, studying them across time at 2, 4, and 6 years of age. Cross-sectional is taking 3 different groups of children, all within a week span maybe, or a day, okay? And they're looking at 2-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and 6-year-olds. And then sequential is doing a combination of longitudinal cross-sectional, where you still are looking at kids across time, but you're also looking at a different group as well. So what are some pros and cons of these? Okay, well, let's look at them. Okay, so in longitudinal, it basically allows us to look at individual differences. It allows us to see, as 2-year-olds, are those 2-year-olds who struggle with attention, are they still the kids at 6 years old who struggle with attention, or does it completely change? And this allows us to look at, do we need to be worried at the age of 2, and do we need to intervene at that time? The problem with this is a lot of times participants drop out, okay, so they might move or they might not want to be included anymore or whatever it might be. And therefore, if we start with 100 kids the first year, we might now drop to 80 participants and 60 participants later on. Cross-sectional, okay, it is more efficient than longitudinal. It's often cheaper. However, we don't get that individual difference across time. And then the last one is sequential. Again, it kind of combines both the positives and the negatives of longitudinal cross-sectional. It allows us to still look a little bit at individual differences across time, but we might have dropout effects. we might have practice effects, which means that if you give the same test from one year to the next, they now are used to it, and therefore they might just do better because of that. All right, I hope that helps. My time is up with Screen-O-Matics, so let me know if you have any questions.